Thank you for joining today's webinar, Achieving Zero Trust Security with Sophos Factory and HashiCorp. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be sent via email to those who registered within 1 to 2 business days. Joining me today is Mike Frazier, VP and Field CTO of DevSecOps at Sophos Factory, as well as Ranjit Viswakumar, who is the Staff Solutions Engineer here at HashiCorp. In this webinar, we'll cover how Sophos Factory and HashiCorp can identify opportunities to elevate operational efficiency and security. The overall agenda for today will start with introductions, and then it will be followed by answers to some common questions like, what is zero trust? How does Console play into zero trust? What is DevSecOps? How does Sophos Factory solve for this? Finally, we will end with a demo followed by resources and Q&A. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available after post-processing. Lastly, please type your questions in the Q&A box at any point during today's presentation, and we'll answer those during the Q&A session at the end. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Mike and Ranjit.
Well, thanks, Priya. We'll talk about the scenario here. So first of all, we're living in a multi-cloud world. And the reason that we go to cloud in general is we want to reap the benefits of speed, agility, and like unlimited scale, to the degree that we can apply here. We can provision things in a matter of clicks, but basically what we're doing there is we're like opening the door to now like security problems or challenges in general, right? So what are we going to do here? So the model we're coming from is basically this fortress model. We have hardware, we have software, and they're both very delineated and segregated. So we're talking about if you're on the outside of the wall, you're potentially a malactor, but once you gain access to the inside, we trust you, we know who you are, and everything is good. And that's used by like firewall zones, IP addresses, subnets, and things like that. But when we talk about the new infrastructure we're going through, this cloud-based or this hybrid infrastructure that we're doing, it gets a little dicey there, right? We don't know what the IPs are. We need to kind of assume some things based on maybe DNS names or something like that. But we can't really now trust things just based on IP address alone. We need a different way of securing and authorizing services to be able to communicate to each other. So the IP address model is kind of falling apart here. So this new model that we're looking at is based on identity. Identity is the idea that no matter where you're coming from, you have some sort of intrinsic thing that names you or that creates you as a thing that can now access services or secrets or passwords, whatever it is, based on that instead of just your IP address being your way in. So if we look at the identity model in days past, applications, the way they normally identify with anything is like, I'm coming from this IP address. This is where I'm coming from. My source IP maps to a destination IP, and there's a rule that allows me to do that. And also networks as well. The DMZ can talk to the back end. The DMZ can talk to the front end. But the front end can't directly talk to the back end, and it's very like isolated or segmented based on zone and IP address subnets, things like that. And then users themselves traditionally log in through something like Active Directory, where they're assigned to a group, and based on that group access, they now can talk to things or not talk to things. But now let's look at the new model that we're entering. So applications, a lot more things going on there, right? Traditional applications, not just deployed on, just say VMware, for example. We have a lot of different platforms where we're applying our applications, and all those systems have a notion of identity. So Kubernetes versus Cloud Foundry versus just like an EC2 instance. It has a profile that it speaks. Like there's a lot of different notions of identities going on there. Looking at our networks, again, we used to maybe focus on the IP address, but we can't do that anymore. There's a lot of different things, like just basically a thing carrying a certificate could have its own identity. Kerberos could have its something with that has its own identity. A lot of things we're working with. Same with user identities. We have a lot of application things like Okta and Duo and GitHub, things that have their own identity platforms. And then we have this entirely new column here called cloud identities. So like all the different cloud platforms have their own notion of identity. This is the way they keep track of their own systems. So GCP does one thing, AWS does one thing, AWS is doing a different thing. They have to keep track of the identity of their own systems. So we have this new column of identities that we're working with. So the first thing that we see at HashiCorp that we need to do is we need to like sort of unify this identity system when it comes to zero trust. Because if you want to walk in the front door and you want to gain privileges, we need to first verify who you are. And with all the different themes going on, all the different access parameters going on, we need to be able to unify that and say like, okay, given all the things you're doing, we know who you are and you have access to such and such. And so HashiCorp Vault is named to do that. Is the first level is let's broker your identity from wherever you're coming from across all platforms. Let's make sure that you are who you say you are, whether you're a user or you're a platform. And that way now we can begin to make decisions on, as a user or as an application, what can you actually gain access to? So when we look at this kind of all-encompassing model, depending on if you're a networking aspect, like a firewall or service or a gateway, or you're an application who needs a certificate or needs to just talk to another service, or you're a user, you need to log in to a system using SSH or RDP, whatever it is, like we want to have an access model that is based on brokering identity, no matter what system you're coming from. So to shift a little, let's talk about when it comes to like zero trust, the idea is we want to mitigate attacks, right? So if we take a look at sort of the general anatomy of an attack, is someone gains access into a network device, like a wireless access point or a router, or just something that seems like pretty incidental. But that's where, number one here, they get initial access. But what then they try to do after they gain access is to like search for this other thing they can do. So like, okay, number one, I got in. Number two, let me try to elevate myself into something where I can see more than I should. And maybe that's because the password is the same, or it's just lying around, or there's not ACLs that are embedded in that device, whatever it is. The next thing you want to do is you want to gain access into a system where you can kind of like traverse the file system and maybe find something else you can do. Find a username and password, and you want to find some credentials that will give you the next level of access into systems beyond your network boundary. And that's where lateral movement happens, where it's like now I've found my way into what is considered a private network via whatever it is on step one. but I found my way now into a private network. And now I can scan the network for systems and see what SSH points are available or what RDP points are available. And I can kind of like maybe batter them and see if I can log into any of them. And then lastly, like once I get into any of those systems via SSH or RDP, my next move is to like, let me find all the data I can and pull that data, download it, and get it somewhere where I can use it. So in this kind of system, the way we kind of lay out how we want to reduce those attack surfaces is, so for that initial access, like even at the router wireless access point in, like on the edge kind of level, like we don't want to have this like everyone logs in with username admin, everyone logs in with the password, blah, blah, blah. But we want to be able to grant access and give audited, ephemeral, and least privileged access to a person when they log into any device. So first thing is like, you want to prove who you are, like log in with your Azure AD credentials or log in with your Okta credentials, prove who you are, and then you'll be granted access enough to log into some device. And then that kind of follows through with the next couple steps here is like you should only have access to what you need to have access to, whether it's the initial access to something or the file system level into like checking out what's there. And then if there is a, like a creds.txt or some sort of file that contains credentials, ideally you want those credentials to be ephemeral so that by the time anyone discovers them, they would likely expire in the next 5 minutes, or they would already be expired because the operation that used them is now completed. So that type of thing. But this next step here is where HashiCorp console comes into play. Is this lateral movement. So a lot of times when we think about like breaches and hacking, we think about like external malactors coming in, finding a way and doing something. But it turns out, like according to VMware's report here, is like a lot of these things happen internally. It's not necessarily an employee that's doing it, but it's like a level of access that you've reached, or something that hasn't been put in check internally is what is used to make these things breachable. So it's not that like some hacker finds like a loophole and gains access to a database directly. It's more that they maybe traverse a couple hops and then internally things aren't great and they're able to discover a credential or discover a port that shouldn't be accessible or make a connection to a socket that shouldn't be there, something like that. So we want to avoid like these kind of insecure practices for having communications just open based on internal information. And we want to make those connections and make those service to service connections or human to service connections based on least privileged access and identity-based access. So this is where HashiCorp console comes in. Console as a baseline, what it does is it does service discovery. So go out there and be like, you're a web service, you're a prod web service, you're a dev web service, you're a prod database, you're a dev database, and it'll literally certify those services as you get this certificate, you get this certificate, and I've validated and named you. And then given the rules that you write in console, saying something like web service A is allowed to talk to database A, it will use those certificates to create this MTLS tunnel and allow those services to speak to each other for the period of time that they need to speak to each other. After they're done transacting, that tunnel will go away. and the certificates can be recycled routinely. So the identity, the idea is that you don't have open connections between all your things until you actually need connections between those services. So in that way, we can make sure that, you know, in a scenario where there's no traffic happening, there should be no connections available between services, that type of idea. And so if we look at these use cases now between the HashiCorp suite as well as the Sophos suite, on the applications side, we're going to certify your humans and your services based on their identity. We have the ability to do data encryption in transit and at rest, and various other things. Like, definitely you want operational governance. What that means is, like, you want to make sure that people are using the system correctly and they're getting value out of the system, and the type of things that they're loading match the type of, like, compliance directives you might have as an organization. So you can get some, like, top level information about that. And in the middle here, for console, so console number one, let's discover the services that you have, let's name them, let's certify them. And then from there, we can get into things like service mesh. We can get into things like updating network devices, even like F5 or Palo Alto devices. We can get into updating that based on the services that we discover. And then we talked a lot about east-west traffic, where things get manipulated. But if you need north-south kind of things, these are your API gateways, your ingress and your egress. We can solve those kinds of issues and make sure those are also, like, certified and named by service. And then for this last column here, I'll ask Mike to jump in.
Thanks, Ranjit. Yep, and then with Sophos Factory, in conjunction with Vault, Console, Terraform, other HashiCorp products, and so forth, we have solution catalogs which are pre-built, and I'll get into that once we get into the Sophos Factory, of pre-built content that can include Console and Vault and Terraform packaged up as solutions that can be immediately used, that are pre-built. Modular pipeline building. So if you're building pipelines for specific use cases, you can chain them together, which is pretty cool. Collaborative automation, multiple teams. So in every organization, a different team may be supporting, say, Console. That may be your DevOps team, that may be your network automation team. Same thing with Vault and so on. So different teams can have responsibility and create and publish out automation. And then the interoperability between systems into Sophos Factory and out to make it super easy to hook in, which is super critical for organizations that pretty much every organization already has existing systems in place that you want to be able to utilize those investments and be able to tie into. And so we can support that across a number of different features, like our API as well as CLI tool and our incoming webhook system. Next slide. And I guess oh yeah, it's the question first, Ranjit.
Yeah, while we bring up this poll here, Mike, I'll probably shift the screen share with you. But yeah, we're just curious for this audience what your experience with Zero Trust is, whether it's something you've already enacted on, something that's in the roadmap for your company, like a term that you've heard in the wind, and it's maybe something you want to talk about. And I like this fourth one here is like, is it something you're doing, you don't even know it, and maybe now looking at some of the diagrams, you're like, hey, I think we're actually doing that. Or is it just something completely new where like then that's okay too? It's you're definitely not alone there. Where like you know, we haven't even thought about this yet, and that's fine.
Awesome. Excited to see what the answers come back on here in the poll, the percentages. There we go. Looks like most people are thinking about implementing in the near term or are currently thinking about it. All right. That's my screen up. All right. So I'll segue in from zero trust into what is DevSecOps. For me, DevSecOps really stands for development, security, and operations. Being able to look at it as more of a holistic approach, leveraging agile principles to not just the automation piece, but also culture and platform design that integrates security as a collaborative responsibility throughout the entire IT as code lifecycle. And I like to hone in on the term IT as code, which is super important because when we think about moving towards everything as code, or as I like to call it, IT as code, we have to think about more than just application development to include different use cases like we were walking through with products like Console around network automation or Vault for secrets management around IAM and so forth. And so a lot of the different use cases out there, especially in the cybersecurity and ops side, are not about application delivery anymore. It's about, or I should say, your own code being released to production. It's also about all of the other supporting systems in place from an IT stack perspective. And so when we think about DevSecOps, we want to think about it more than just adding application security to DevOps. We want to think about it more holistically, where we can think about various different use cases that may or may not be used to release your applications to production. It may be, third-party applications that you need to put in an agile approach and have in place the systems and the automation that makes sense for your organization, and then also the collaborative piece between DevOps, security, and ops teams. So DevSecOps automation really as a life cycle, we want to think about it through all of the different various stages, from planning to evaluating the needs and what you're actually going to build towards, which tools you're going to pick. If it's going to be, Terraform, if you're looking for zero trust stuff with Console, what that actually means, and outlining requirements, looking from a build perspective, how you're going to build those tools into iterative, agile type pipelines, not just from a deployment standpoint, but also thinking about it again more holistically, where you should be including the configuration, even doing how you could build response pipelines around incident response to the deployments that you create, continuous integration on continuing to deploy and validate and confirm the configurations. I see a lot of organizations where drift becomes a problem. So you want to make sure that you have the enforcement of state, and then deploying to look towards detecting security anomalies and different changes, and also how you can automate the, again, response actions to your deployments. And then really when we get into the operate and continuous feedback stages, we're really looking at how can we monitor user activity, how can we think about the remediation of risks more in an automated way, how can we visualize things, and also continuing to have more of a dynamic approach to identity and access management with like Vault and Console, and being able to think about the compliance needs of your organization and how you can also utilize the different stages to get data that can be then correlated together to make it easier from a reporting standpoint. So from a standpoint of thinking about DevSecOps, we really want to think about now, all right, how does that actually equate to and how is Sophos Factory solving for that? So Sophos Factory is a DevSecOps automation platform. As I alluded to earlier, it's about collaborative automation between DevSec and Ops teams. So each team can have shared responsibility to build automation in a modular way. I like to call them building blocks, where each of those building blocks can be part of a solution. A building block maps to a use case. That's where it really gets into the use case driven automation. So if that's around, network automation, if that's around infrastructure automation and security, or all the way to the right-hand side of the lifecycle to the incident response, thinking about which teams are responsible for each of those, and then the use cases of what you're trying to actually achieve in the organization, truly to achieve DevSecOps, the collaboration between DevSec and Ops teams, leveraging automation. Another key piece is the ability to support various DevOps and security tools that may or may not be open. That may be open source, that may be maybe commercial products, but the key is to be able to mix and match those and build towards more of this approach of, like I was saying earlier, IT as code solutions, where you can have different building blocks utilized in your overall solution, and then also future-proofing yourself. So if one product works for you today, another works for you tomorrow, or you have some sort of, maybe it's a ITSM or chat ops that you want to incorporate into the mix that you're using, and you swap out that in the future, you have the ability to do that. The other thing is if you're adding more things too, so if it's something like leveraging HashiCorp console, and you decide to change out your particular network equipment or add additional equipment, you have the ability to then create more additional pipelines, more in a building block slash modular type approach. And then really the key piece to all of this is the more of the open ecosystem enablement to support various different vendors through automation, which is super critical. And then also being able to package up what makes sense for you, because really, if you think about the end of the day, when you're building out pipelines in Sophos Factory, you're building your own IP, intellectual property. You may leverage stuff that's published out, like we've worked with HashiCorp out there, but you want to make it your own and add in different systems that you want to integrate into or create automation around. So thinking about how it works for you from the ecosystem of products that you have in place, which is super important to make it as flexible and easy as possible to be able to do that, because every single organization is different, from the tools to the products that you're trying to integrate into. So really thinking about that long term, again, future proofing yourself so you have a path forward no matter what changes in the organization and what different use cases that you're trying to solve for. So I like this. I created this slide because I wanted to kind of show the overall kind of thought process around taking the life cycle that you see out there in the typical infinity sign out there around plan, code, build, and test on pre-production, and release, deploy, monitor, and respond. Thinking about that from a use case standpoint. So then if we go into like, what am I using for my version control from when the very first time I'm creating the code for what I'm trying to do, all the way from application security to incident response around XDR, MDR. And so when we think about that, the goal is that each of these become building blocks that I may use a single building block to go do something. But the reality is most use cases are a compilation between different use cases to create the solution that you're trying to target. Identity and access management spans all of the use cases because you need that. It's for everything. So when you're thinking about leveraging Vault and how that can be used across the different systems that you're utilizing, to console and all the different network automation that you're trying to create, or applications that you're trying to tie into different systems that you're trying to tie into, that may not be specific to a particular use case, but you want to use it across all of the different use cases that you're creating your automation around. So thinking about that longer term as you're creating your automation building blocks, thinking about how you can create them in such a way that can be useful across all use cases. And also thinking about and this doesn't cover obviously all the different vendors out there, but there's a lot of different vendors in your organization that you're going to want to use, and then also, or that you already have in place that you're using, and then also what you're trying to do in the future. If you're mandated by the organization, you have to use a different cloud provider for some reason, or you need to use different tools as well. So just thinking about that longer term, as you can again future-proof yourself and be able to create things in a much more modular way to make it easy to incorporate adding or removing products in the future. So Sophos Factory is really about, again, the collaboration between DevSec and Ops teams. When we think about where Sophos Factory sits, most organizations already have existing investments into existing products like existing CI/CD, where you may have a Jenkins or a GitLab or a GitHub in place. And so the goal is to provide the ability to have a user experience from a cybersecurity and ops team so that they can have the ability to be a part of not just the automation process, but also as a user experience that is geared towards them around more of a visual approach. If we think about it in the cybersecurity world, most of the products that are used and that are out there are UI driven. And so we really want to think about this from a standpoint of how can we provide a user experience to cybersecurity and ops teams, but still have the features and functionality in place that makes it useful for the DevOps and development teams, and then the ability to tie it in to those existing systems. So as I mentioned earlier on the slide around zero trust use cases, when we think about the ability to have the interoperability between systems, we really want to think about how this can be tied into existing systems, and then also how you could tie into systems inside of pipelines in Sophos Factory. And then thinking about the different use cases, because some things you may have in CI/CD already, but I've seen organizations even moving out of their existing systems and moving them into Sophos Factory, stuff like infrastructure automation, because it makes it easier to be able to give other teams the ability to consume. I look at there's being two different buckets of types of users, the producers of automation content and the consumers. And the issue with most systems out there right now is that the ability for users to consume that automation is very difficult, because most of the products out there have been created for developers. If you think about like a GitHub or a GitLab, so if you're creating like a GitHub action, that's really developer focused. And so we really want to think about the ability to have collaboration between those teams. So it's not a developer only product or a cybersecurity and ops only product. It's really something that's can be cohesively used between each of those teams, with the understanding that there's still a lot of brownfield deployments out there. So if you're going to start building greenfield automation content, you want to be able to tie it right into the existing workflows. And sometimes it doesn't make any sense to remove existing workflows out of your organization either, because you have a lot of time, money invested into that as well. And so it gives you the flexibility to pick and choose where you want to incorporate those use cases into your existing process. And then the other thing I'll hone in on is from a deployment standpoint, or from a solution standpoint, most organizations out there still have a hybrid approach between on-premise and public cloud. And we think about things like Console and HashiCorp Vault, the ability to tie into the equipment that you have on-premise, like network equipment, where that will always exist on-premise. You need the ability to have to be able to run pipelines against on-premise equipment, and then also in the public cloud. And so I look at that as being like a hard requirement for the ability to support the various use cases that Sophos Factory brings to the table, to make sure, and the ability to support that with something like Console, which makes it super critical from a standpoint of what you need to be able to run the automation against. The last piece I'll hone in on here is the solution catalog. So one thing we did was create this feature to make it easier for the consumption and sharing of pipelines, because that's a very difficult thing in most organizations, where if you tell a cybersecurity team, hey, here's a Git repo, and I want you to just run the content against the with the tools, and here's some documentation. Well, we need to have a better approach to that, and give the ability of cybersecurity and ops teams the ability to consume the content and start working within the system that then they can also become producers too. And also thinking about developers as being changing the definition of developers, where we're no longer thinking that folks that can create scripts or utilize DSLs out there can be a developer of sorts and be able to create automation as well and produce the automation, but they need to be able to use it first before they get there. And so this adds a way to make it easier for those teams to now have a seat at the table when the automation is being created in organizations, and really enabling this whole concept of being able to truly achieve DevSecOps. All right, it's demo time. So I will let you share, Ed. Well, and as we're walking through the demo too, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A chat, so we can answer them at the end of this webinar. All right, so we built some really cool. So one of the key pieces about HashiCorp Console is that it takes some time to set up, and even with HCP Console, you want to have a really easy way to stand this up. And from that last poll that we saw, it looks like a lot of folks are looking to start getting into zero trust, and so we wanted to have a path forward to make it easy to even deploy and stand up HashiCorp Console. So go ahead and go into the builder. So we've created a couple of pipelines. This one with EC2 we're going to show in the demo. We also have one with EKS, and we will continue to build more content around console that we'll be able to share out there. And this is really around, again, the concept of consumer, where you can utilize this from a solution catalog. You can sign up for Sophos Factory with Community Edition, which is free. So you can reach out to us and you can use this content from the solution catalog. And then in this content, there's a pipeline. That pipeline is leveraging the existing content from a public GitHub repo that some HashiCorp engineers have created for this. But as I stated earlier, just having it in a Git repo and trying to stand it up still takes some time. And so we set up a pipeline here that will allow you to quickly fill in some input variables and actually run this thing to make it super easy from a consumption standpoint. And if we walk through this, you'll notice too, this is cloning that repo from GitHub. We're going to set up the Terraform vars or the TFRs in here, and then write the state out. We're also installing Terraform as well in here, so we can set the Terraform version that we want or pin that version in here as well. And then this will actually run through and create a bunch of different things. It'll set up what you need in the cluster in the console cluster in HCP. This will create an EC2 instance. This will set up Nomad and also set up your VPC peering. And you can go to this. We can include this in the recording when it gets sent out, so you can see which project is here. But it's doing a bunch of different things that if you're trying to go run this one off would take some time to get set up. And then we also, if you go to the variables, we have up top, if we go to the variables, you'll notice here too, we have a bunch of different things to get started, make it easy. So different things from credentials to the region you're going to deploy to, your HCP service principal, your console name, all the things you just need to be able to set up your console cluster, your VPC information, and then some information of stuff around the Terraform version to make sure that there aren't breaking changes on the on an upgrade of a Terraform version that we've all felt the pain on before. And then the ability to also output information too. So that way you can go in and check out your console setup, be able to go and see, make sure that the HashiCorp's application is set up. And then you can also log into Nomad. So if you want to go to the job we have set up. So we have a job set up that overlays this pipeline that makes it super easy to also control the input variables and the type of run here too. So when you're setting this up, you can use this straight from the solution catalog. There's already default settings in here too, but you can set up some of your own settings in here as well, depending on what you want to set up. And then this job will run, it takes about 20 minutes, but we'll show an example since we don't have time for the whole thing to run on this webinar. But we'll show, so this will kick off the run. This will go through and run the whole pipeline from end to end. If we go to an example, you want to go back to an example job, Ed? So this will run through all the steps that you saw inside of the pipeline to set particular variables at the very beginning. This will go through and run your Terraform stages as well to go through this. And then this will output the data that we saw there to give you quick access to see the state. Because it's just a demo, we can actually store state in a input variable. Obviously, you could push this off to state management somewhere else. We also have all of the login URLs that you need to be able to access like your HCP console. So if you want to go to that, you can see this gets set up. So this will set up the cluster and everything you need for the ability to get access to the HashiCorp's application. So you can see it's up and running and working. We have one already up and running, and then this one is running to create. This will create your cluster and also the VPC peering, so that it will automatically set up everything for you. So you can run through and see that how the different steps in here are set up. But it makes it super easy. So you basically don't even have to do any additional work here other than filling in those input variables that we showed in the pipeline. And then it also sets up Nomad as well. So you can also log into Nomad with the same credentials. So this makes it super easy to see what gets set up in Nomad too, with your HashiCorp or HashiCorp's, I should say, application, and what's required to be able to access that as well. And then once the whole pipeline runs through, you'll be able to see the HashiCorp's application. So you can see it up and running and functional. It also reminds me that I need more coffee. So thank you for this application. But it's cool that it lets you go through and see that this application's up and running. And you can see that it's working and functional. One other thing to note as well here is that this isn't like an end state. This is to get you going. So we also have the EKS example as well that you can get access to. A little more advanced pipeline that's published out. That one will stand up an EKS cluster, a Kubernetes cluster, managed Kubernetes cluster in AWS. So this will do the same thing as we're doing with the EC2 instance, but it'll actually stand up the EKS cluster as well. And so everything is structured the same way, so you can still get access to your HashiCorps and console HCP and so on. But you can also see what's deployed with Kubernetes as well. And Ed, if you want to go back to the EC2 pipeline, we'll show you what the art of the possible is here as well. So if I open this up in the builder, I want to make this my own. You can clone it into your project. And then in here, you can actually add to it. So we're using our credential manager because it's super easy to get started with. So if you see things like AWS credentials in here, but the nice thing is we have Vault support as well. So you can actually drag and drop the Vault module in, and you can leverage that instead of our credential manager. And we have an app role credential type that you can utilize and set this up and leverage the AWS Secrets Engine or KV or so on. And you can tie into HCP Vault or Vault Enterprise or Vault Open Source as well. So it gives you the ability to also then iterate on this and be able to then add in Vault as well. The other thing I'll mention here too is from a console standpoint, you can actually create, so we don't actually have a console module, but you can create a pipeline around console to be able to leverage it in here and create little building blocks around different things like wanting to, so say you deploy a firewall, like a, Sophos firewall or Fortinet FortiGate or, different network equipment or virtual or physical. You can actually set up a pipeline that can install console and then also set up the ability to tie into console as well or tie into Vault and encapsulate it basically with any of the tools we have. So if you're using Terraform to do that, you can basically create a pipeline around that and then use it as a building block in another pipeline. So an example of that would be, I think, no, that's the other pipeline. So if you go to the catalog of pipelines, if you wanted to do even other things outside of that, of different integrations and so on, we could go to our like notifications integrations. You can build building blocks around even things like sending a Slack message. So I want to dump a bunch of information about the run in here. I want to put all those outputs that I saw into a Slack message. You can drag and drop pre-built Slack, or should I say pre-built pipelines that you can drag and drop in into here. So you can basically customize and make this your own. And it makes it super easy to, again, as I mentioned earlier, future-proof this. So if your organization mandates you have to absolutely use Teams internally, then you can have that now. But if you get approval in the future for, Slack or use Slack or vice versa, you can create pipelines that encapsulate the automation inside of it. And we have all kinds of different modules. So the Slack message actually uses a HTTP request module, but you can do the same thing with, Terraform and Vault and any of the other modules that we have built in. And then if it's something that we don't support or from a module standpoint, you can encapsulate that into any of these modules into a pipeline, create custom inputs and outputs, and it gives you a nice modular way to create the little or create your building blocks that you want to include in your pipeline building. So it makes it super easy from that perspective. Makes it easy from a standpoint of being able to leverage content from various different solution catalogs. And then the other thing to think about too is the different use cases. So if we go back to the lifecycle that I was showing here earlier, this is great because I want to stand this up and deploy this. Deploy console, stand it up, set up an application so I can get access to it. When you actually want to move to building stuff from that you would actually use in production, you'll want to also think about other use cases around the ability to leverage things like Center for Internet Security SysCAD, or MITRE has a security automation framework program that we work with that has different, or has a bunch of stuff built around, like say, Chef Inspect, and so on. And so the goal is that if you have these building blocks, you can utilize them. So if I want to do a scan, leveraging a particular tool that it's available, or you can publish it yourself if you want to even do like private solution catalogs just to your organization. And it gives you the ability to then leverage those as building blocks too. So that would fit in the compliance lifecycle. So if we think about that, then we have the ability to now incorporate other building blocks that are use cases that are able to use in the pipeline, that I'm now chaining together different use cases so I can basically get the end result of which is a solution. And then over time, if say I want to assess SysCat, I want to use SysCat today, but tomorrow I want to use Inspect or whatever other tool, maybe then I can utilize those. I can just swap them out, set up my inputs and outputs, and now I have a compliant, a scan that I can use for compliance purposes if I'm trying to scan against a CIS benchmark or a STIG or whatever else. So now I'm basically mix and matching, the IAM use case, the compliance use case, infrastructure use case, network automation use case, and integrations. So now I got a bunch of different use cases in here. I can create very complicated automation in a very modular way. And so it gives you that flexibility to build what you want now. You can start small and incorporate additional use cases over time. And then it gives you the ability to be very flexible on what you may or may not want to use inside of your pipeline. And so you can swap things out over time. And then if you think about this as well, do you also, maybe you're not going to use Factory to run Terraform. Maybe you use Terraform Cloud. You have the ability too, where you can tie in to Terraform Cloud too. So if you wanted to run the same thing, you could also do that as well. And we did a bunch of work around, different other tools like IAC scanning and so on that you could incorporate in as well by themselves or into your existing workflow, which also goes back to my other point, which is the ability to tie into existing systems you may use. So that may be CI/CD, but that may also be things like Terraform Cloud too. So you have the flexibility to be able to tie this into existing systems that you may have in place to make it easy. And then we have support for various other tools in here as well. So if you want to use other things like Aquasec, Trivy, or so on, tools that we have built in. And then again, you can also set up pipelines that you can leverage tools that we may not even have in here as modules. So again, just kind of a full recap, super flexible. These pipelines are available in the solution catalog. You can get started with them today. We spent a lot of time with HashiCorp over over months of time going through and getting this stuff set up. This is not the destination. This is just the first step in the journey with HashiCorp on additional content we'll build. So we're looking at creating stuff around the console to Terraform sync, other ability to tie in console with different vendors at working building, different use cases around infrastructure deployment, like firewalls in the cloud, being able to run configuration against firewalls, leveraging console. So there's going to be a lot more coming with this, but you can get started with this because the biggest issue with trying to begin your zero trust journey is to see what the art of the possible is and start leveraging or getting quickly to seeing even how all this stuff works together. All right, thanks, Ed.
Yeah, and just 2 cents I'll add there, Mike. You mentioned HashiCups. HashiCups is just like some generic application that we print in front end, like coffee store with a product API, inventory API, just some random elements we put together to showcase like how we would use our products. That's one thing. And the good I think one of the major points that Mike highlighted in Factory is that you're going to have these pipelines that do things and that need access to stuff. And a lot of times we get in the habit of embedding credentials into these pipelines and saving them like static credentials into these things. And we don't want to do that. And the cool thing about Factory is it can reach out to Vault, it can get creds to do the thing it needs to do for the time that it needs to do it. And that's kind of the idea of zero trust. It's like, let's not give admin privileges to a pipeline forever just so it can do what it needs to do. But like, let's give it ephemeral, timed, least privileged credentials for the period of time that it needs to operate, and then they go away. And that's the zero trust emphasis there.
Yeah, exactly. And the ability to create pipelines that you can also use for specific systems as well, to make sure that you're also putting in processes in place in a more standardized way. So you say, this is how I want you to use Vault with AWS. Here's the pipeline. Use this every time, right? And so it gives you a very repeatable way to do that. We have a question: how much data is managed on premise versus how much is on Sophos systems? So I think I know what you're asking. So Sophos Factory is actually its own platform. We are integrating it into Sophos Central. So you have access for some of the use cases that I showed earlier inside of Central around like incident response, around response action stuff we're doing, and some other cool stuff with XDR. As for Sophos Factory itself, it can be actually deployed as its own Kubernetes cluster into any environment as well. So you can actually have a deployment of it in your environment, managing all of the data inside of your environment. So I guess the answer is it depends on what your use case is and how you want to use it, but we have options depending on what that looks like for you, for your organization. Yep, no worries. You're welcome, Sean. All right, we have 2 minutes. Any more questions? And you can always follow up with our contact, Rajit, and my contact information if you have questions after this webinar as well. I think we answered everything. We covered it all.
All right, great.
Right.
Thanks, Mike and Ranjit. And thank you everyone for joining and asking questions today. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, today's recording will be available within the next few business days, and we'll send an email to everyone who registered with the recording link, and it will also be posted on HashiCorp's YouTube channel. If there's no more questions, we'll let you all go. Thank you for joining and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.